So welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's Friday forum and the breakout session called Savior Complex Racism and Philanthropy, Challenging Deficit-Based Thinking in Fundraising. We have lots and lots to cover, and I want to be sure that we have a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to run through some key concepts and theoretical perspectives that I like. So again, we'll do some introductions, key terms, and foundational concepts. We'll talk a little bit about what is deficit-based thinking. And as a part of that, we'll even talk about asset-based thinking and maybe shifting it to asset-based thinking. We'll talk about racial equity in philanthropy and a little bit more context there. And then I've got just a few tools for you all. And I want to acknowledge that that this is going to be focused a lot on race. But as Angela Davis says, Bell Hooks says, Angela Davis came yesterday, sorry. Bell Hooks says, racism can't be fully understood without examining sexism, classism, and heterosexism. And we really have to think intersectionally about this work. And so I really appreciate any lens that really thinks intersectionally. There's going to be lots of key terms like microaggressions, anti-Blacknessism, bias, whiteness, entering whiteness, privilege, that we are just going to gloss right over. But I encourage you all to dive deeper into those different topics. I also just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. This is the university's official land acknowledgement statement that we are on ancestral homelands. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to do a labor acknowledgement that higher education was fundamentally built on labor, and particularly exploited labor and labor of Black and Brown people. So I also want to acknowledge that I had never seen a labor acknowledgement until Dr. Chris Linder presented it with the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention, and just really appreciated that addition there. Okay, here's me. He, him, his pronouns. I'm a brown male in my 30s, black short hair, glasses, blue shirt, red or a blue tie with red and kind of white stripes, gray blazer, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. I'm an activist, Aries. I love astrology. And then I'm a karaoke. If anybody knows me, I think I've invited them to karaoke at some point. And if I haven't, please let me know, because you'll get an invite to virtual karaoke or in-person karaoke when that's safe. It's my favorite thing in the world. And if you don't like to sing, totally fine. I like an audience. So it's my favorite. And then I'm the senior director for principal gifts and advancement. I've worked on campus since 2005 as a student employee from 2005 to about 2009 or 10. And then since then in the advancement office, and I basically fundraise. That includes student projects, endowments, building projects, health side, main campus side. I work closely with all of our museums, cultural entities, arts organizations, student support organizations. I get to do a lot. So it's such a rewarding career path. But you'll see why it's so critical that we have this conversation around deficit-based thinking and philanthropy, especially if you are out fundraising or talking about the university and appealing for support. Let's see here. Okay, I'm gonna just glaze through these so quickly. Yesterday was the conference on the conference on diverse excellence. And we went through some of these key concepts, but today I want to have more of a discussion. So really quickly, prejudice is an attitude based on limited information, often stereotypes. It could be positive, negative, kind of in the middle there. Racism, and I really take this critical race theory definition of racism, and it's way more broad than this. But it's different from racial prejudice, hatred, and discrimination. Racism involves a group having power, that's the key word there, to carry out systemic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of society by shaping cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. Then we have anti-racist, and I want to be really clear that anti-racist is different than DEI. There's overlap, but this is to be an racist is different than just doing DEI work. I want to be kind of clear on that. Um, uh, Anti-racist is one who supports an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Dr. Ibram Kendi's book has been really popular. Talks about racism itself as an institutional, structural, and systemic. Anti-racism challenges this at all levels. Then we have racial microaggressions. Ella is here. Ella has a wonderful, wonderful training on microaggressions. But racial microaggressions can be intentional or unintentional. Most of the time, it's unintentional, and sometimes even well-meaning. But they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial messages or assumptions to the receiver. And this is Beverly Daniel Tatum's definition, or Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who used to be the former president of Spelman College. And then we have diversity, equity, inclusion. There are so many great analogies out there. This is one I kind of liked. Diversity is where everyone is invited to the party. Equity means that everyone gets to contribute to the playlist. Inclusion means that everyone has an opportunity to dance. And you can take this further. I've heard people say belonging is an important part of that, and belonging is deciding the theme of the dance and more of the logistics of the dance and being having a seat at the table. So there's lots of different analogies out there. I liked this one as a sort of base concept. Okay, now I'm going to talk about, this is going to be really hard because this is a really complex theoretical area of study. And I'll be very clear, I'm not an academic in any way. I'm a practitioner, but I really like grounding some of my work in critical race theory. This is something that came out of legal scholarship and has really transformed in the educational field. There's a lot of critical paradigms that this pulls off of. But basically, the first kind of tenet or thought is that we are taught and socialized this way. We are taught and socialized to be racist. It is in the air we breathe. And so you can be completely anti-racist and you're still breathing air that's racist. It's almost like pollution. One person can't get away from pollution if it's in the air. And so I think it really brings point the anti-racism piece of it is that we have to change the air. I'm glazing through this so quickly, but there's the idea of intent versus impact. And it may be well-meaning, but it could have a negative impact. Microaggressions is a great space to sort of look at the unintended consequences. A CRT basically says it's not just a few bad apples. We can even look at it from a political lens. Both the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, have all had policies, every administration, that have been incredibly damaging to communities of color and intersectional identities. We're seeing it right now, and that doesn't mean that one side isn't more helpful in these policies and that we can bridge. But it's important to know that race, no one side has a monopoly on racism. That it's a structural piece, and so we always have to constantly challenge it. I will talk a little bit about the resistance of whiteness. A big important part of critical race theory is storytelling. And I would even say the agency of storytelling as a form of resistance, particularly from marginalized and communities of color. The important piece there, I think, is the agency. Another way to sort of look at it, my background I'm on the board of the Rape Recovery Center and the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention. I think a lot about consent. I think we have to talk about what does consent for those narratives of communities of color look like, and how does that play into our fundraising efforts. Um, so I'm just putting that piece out there. But for me, it was really empowering when I was studying critical race theory in school to talk about, oh, these narratives can be a really strong form of resistance. And I really appreciated that. Um, and then, of course, this goes back to the bell hooks point that intersectionality is so critical to this work. You bring your full identity, or the hope is that you're able to bring your full identity to a conversation. Um, we all have multiple identities. And then critical race theory pulls from so many different scholarship, critical race theory, critical Marxist, post-colonial, uh, uh, ethnic studies, a strong tradition of ethnic studies. There's so many theoretical perspectives that critical race theory pulls from. It is such a broad topic. If you ever get a chance to take a critical race studies class or several workshops, we've got some incredible critical race theory scholars here on our campus, including Dr. William Smith, who really kind of coined the term racial battle fatigue. Such an incredible area of study. So I'll just sort of put that out there. We went through a lot of concepts. Okay, I want to talk about impact, particularly impact in our sector and impact in philanthropy. Many people of color learn to accommodate white people's needs, status, and emotions, such as avoiding racial discourse and minimizing white fragility and distress. We ask that researchers and practitioners recognize the pervasiveness and normalness of white supremacy and its underpinning functions of structural racism. This is from Professor William Ming Lu with the University of Maryland. I thought it was a really good quote. And to dive even deeper about on kind of structural racism, let's look at our sector. So there was a really incredible study that came out in May 2020 that talks about racial equity and philanthropy and the disparities in funding of leaders of color versus their white counterparts. This looked at a wide variety of nonprofits, including higher education. And what it found was that there was a significant disconnect with white philanthropists and major foundations and their support for organizations that were led by people of color. And that's incredibly concerning in our sector, partially because our sector was in the United States was largely created by communities of color and voices of communities of color. And that history just sort of gets lost. And so I thought this was a really important part of that study. And I'll attach the study as well in the chat in just a second. But the two biggest factors holding back philanthropy's quest for social change is understanding the role of race in the problems philanthropists are trying to solve. And number two, the significance of race in how philanthropists identify leaders and solutions. And I'd also take it one step further and say there's that whole adage of try not to do more harm. If you are trying to solve a problem but don't know what the problem is, or don't have an idea of the communities that are impacted and a depth of knowledge in that, that's a challenge, that's a problem. And so that means you're not having a full spectrum of diversity at the table. So really interesting study, but I really wanted to put that out there because I think it's some really good context building. Here's this sort of the summary. When it comes to philanthropic funding, attitudes around BIPOC community, the racial disparity is clear. population level impact, sorry for the spelling error there, and the issues donors care about cannot happen without funding more leaders of color and funding them more deeply. Okay, now we're going to get to deficit-based thinking and asset-based thinking, and then we're going to look at some examples. And this is where I really want to open it up to the group to have a bit of a discussion. So looking at something, or looking at a deficit-based or negative perspective around diversity often is lowering the bar. It perceives individuals and groups who are historically impacted by systems of oppression and people in need as uneducated, poor, unmotivated. I hear the term a lot of at risk. Deficit-based mindsets continue to reinforce stereotypes that perpetuate false narratives about individuals and groups. Deficit-based language is used to support deficit thinking. This type of language uses words that connotate negative characteristics about individuals or groups from historically underrepresented backgrounds. It is often subtle and usually attached to a positive cause. So words like at-risk youth, disabled person, poor people, there's these people, I've seen that a lot in proposals. It's sort of an us-them mentality that we are sort of there to save someone. There's a hero mentality, and we'll talk about white saviorism in a second. And then there's a lot of putting your own biases in the narrative. And so we'll get to the kind of the do's afterwards, but I thought it was important to just give a context behind deficit-based thinking, and then we'll talk about asset-based thinking. Here's just a few examples of kind of the images you see and that are really popular around philanthropy. There's the whole Tom's model where it's give a shoe, or get a shoe, give a shoe. We actually found out that there were some really problematic challenges with the Tom's model in that it really hurt local economies and local businesses, and it was creating a need for a product that wasn't necessary in some cases. It really did some damage, and the profit didn't end up going to the communities. So that was a really good example of kind of white saviorism. Here's just a classic Instagram post that you see. You see this a lot with service learning, where you're going to where there's white students going to a country and doing a service learning project and taking pictures on their Instagram or photos. You see this all the time. And then Hollywood really popularizes this as well. I mean, there's sort of the nice white lady narrative of the white lady going into the inner city school and teaching mostly students of color. And then, of course, she learns more from the students, and they learn from her, but not really. And it's a whole thing. And the power dynamic is never discussed, and they're all equals. And that's such a popular narrative in Hollywood. And it still happens all the time. So I wanted to just open it to the group. Where else do we see this? And maybe we'll start with, where do we see this in higher education?
I think we see this in higher education with merit-based allocations for, financial aid.
Yeah, Catherine, do you mind talking a little bit about that? So these are scholarships that are typically based on grade, academic achievement.
Yeah. So if we understand that there's like intersectionality that plays a major role in disparity and disproportionate number of individuals who can engage in higher education, then we understand that it perpetuates itself. Like the system feeds it into itself. Those that are able to get private tutors and dedicate a lot of resources to earning high merits are also the ones that are benefiting from merit-based scholarships. And then it feeds into a system of tokenization, like where the very few individuals who come from demographics that are disproportionately impacted in a way serve as what's the word, as modeling and teaching their peers about disparity, and also not having like access to the same benefits that are just given through privilege.
That makes a lot of sense. And we look at standardized testing, and all the major data points in the past, since the terrible bell curve came out, have suggested that that is not a good, significant indicator of a student's success or even academic success in college. And standardized testing completely reinforces inequities. So that's such a good example, and that's further enforced by a lot of merit-based scholarships that are tied to maybe standardized testing, and also access. Not every student has had access to tutoring or the same educational access. That makes so much sense. Any other examples in higher education where we see this?
Are you seeing the chat window, Dhiraj? You have a lot.
Oh, you know what? I'm not. Let me pull that up. That makes sense. Here we go. Yeah, Katie, you see this a lot in writing grants for first generation students. Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I mean, I think you kind of mentioned it. Sorry, I'm getting like notifications left and right here. You talked about it a little bit, just that, these poor first gen underrepresented populations in higher ed, kids, they just need your support. They just need to be helped by the white businessman. I mean, I work for the School of Business, so I don't think we intentionally try to paint that picture, but it does happen often.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I call it the list. A lot of times, one of my roles was corporate foundation relations, and so I review all the different campus areas proposals to some key funders. And the thing I've seen a lot when describing students, it's like, oh, they're on the west side of Salt Lake, and there's a lot of crime and poverty and food scarcity, and they sort of try to make a case of all the different things that could potentially be a challenge in West Salt Lake City. And then they'll put, oh, and they're students of color, as though those are all sort of the same line of listing. And it's all really deficit based, but to sort of put that they're a student of color as that being the challenge is a really good example of deficit based thinking in our world around scholarships. Jill, I'm going to put you on the spot, but you talked a little about photos we use on the website and proposals and reporting to donors. You want to elaborate on that? Okay, Jill might not be here. I think it's something, if you haven't noticed it before. Oh,
Jill wrote in the chat that their microphone isn't working.
Oh, okay. No worries, Jill. Dr. Pillow, I'd love to dissect you Giving Day a little bit. Do you mind speaking to that? Okay, Dr. Pillow's mic might not be on as well. But certainly I've seen deficit-based narratives from time to time, really unintentional, but it is sort of like help. I think people have done a better job of not using needy students or at-risk students on our Giving Day. I don't think I saw an example of that this year. It's really the language has evolved quite a bit, so that's good. But certainly some things that can be analyzed with some of the Giving Day project pages, and I'll say, like, I'm not perfect at that as well, and I'm raising money for the For Utah Scholarship. That's support for students who are Pell eligible, 3.2 GPA, and a Utah student, and it's pretty much no cost tuition and fees. And when we sort of look at providing access, or what it looks like for access, I mean, that's a scholarship and a program that really could use some help with analyzing the deficit-based thinking around that, because it's not necessarily the university providing these scholarships for students. It really is addressing a critical structural need that hasn't been addressed. And so the access is not to get more students of color here or underrepresented students. It's to address a need where there's structural racism that prevents students from having full access to the university. Okay, let's see if there's another example here. Hardship based off of analysis that are biased based on whatever review committee. Ariel, I'd love to hear more about that if your mic's working.
Can you hear me at all?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. So I recently had a conversation. I'm not an advancement person, so that's not my background. And I wanted to participate in You Giving Day for the Transgender Health Program, and I'm realizing I personally used a lot of deficit language without knowing. But part of my conversation was with the legal team around trying to create a scholarship for BIPOC communities to access care. And they said, yeah, our hardship analysis is based on some of these categories, and we just review it and kind of talk about what we think. And I said, oh, that sounds a little biased to me. And they said that that's kind of the standard process by which they do it. They have a couple of categories that they look at, but ultimately it's the review committee that looks at that hardship analysis and makes the decision on whether or not hardship is determined for that scholarship. And they also said that race was not a reason that we could input, and that even though racism is an experience that creates hardship, it wouldn't be kind of considered within that hardship analysis.
I by the way, I donated to that project for Giving Day. It was one of the
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I loved the artwork, and I don't know if that was a student artwork or what, but I felt like that there was just it was a really well done page. But it also, you're right, like we have to look at what we do as fundraisers, and the truth is, deficit-based narratives sell. I mean, that's a reality. Deficit-based narratives absolutely sell. There are people who are drawn to those narratives because it's so pervasive. And going to your point around review committees, the University of Utah is not allowed, and no public institution is allowed to offer race-based scholarships or gender-based scholarships. That's an example of structural challenge that we're sort of operating under. But that's a really good point. I'd also say, I'd also want to be really careful about saying hardship and race with hardship, because I also don't want to have a deficit based around, oh, they're race, they're a person of color, so they have to be receiving hardship, and so that's something to also kind of analyze too, that all of us have to sort of look at our biases, and particularly on these committees, like what are those different biases, and how do you build systems and policies that can kind of address systemic structures within a system that's racist. It's so complicated. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, we're gonna kind of go on just a little bit, unless we have any other thoughts about higher education, because I really want to talk a little bit about healthcare. I know I've got a lot of my U of U health colleagues on here. Where do we see this in healthcare, and and maybe even talking about healthcare disparities or community clinics or diseases, or even just health in large, where do we see deficit-based thinking?
I'm thinking, I'm kind of at the place where what you just said was the first thing I thought, which is we tend to describe communities that we want to help as being low income. We'll say, like, this community needs to be helped because they're low income, predominantly minority, we lump those things together. Like,
Yeah.
Well, can I call on Jackie? Can I call on someone else?
No, Lynn, you're totally fine. And
Yeah.
Jackie, do you have any thoughts?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Audrey,
you.
hi.
Oh, hi. I was just going to say, so Reese Vetter, who's also on this call with me, we're actually working on an acknowledgement for Giving Day for the South Main Clinic. And we're like, do we have deficit-based language in our acknowledgement for this campaign? And also another one that comes to mind is, when we're messaging about global surgery and, the white male doctor coming in to save, all the children, like that's something that we're always kind of aware of in our in our narrative and in our imagery.
Such a good point.
I think there's also something around charity care, right? By just calling it charity care. I know people are trying to move away from that, but that's kind of the default.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That's totally, absolutely. Jackie.
Yeah. Hi, guys. So I've actually been struggling with this with our current charge by Dr. Good for the underrepresented populations scholarship that we are building and fundraising for at the moment. Because personally, some of it, because it's only a 2-year charter, so 2 years of funding. Part of the narrative that I'm trying to get past is this narrative of tokenism, that it's only for 2, whereas personally I would like to see it built as an endowment for a longer term. But it's also about the fact that the language challenge of crafting a document that we can take as an individual, self-identifying as a person who is white, who believes that we should have this equity and access to people to speak authentically about raising scholarships for BIPOC. What do we do to make sure we are doing this with an authentic voice? And so part of that challenge, I have Dr. Michael Chen on our board. He's a young alum, and he's very passionate about this. So I'm trying to inform myself before I even step into this arena. So I would welcome some feedback on that.
Yeah, any thoughts or feedback from the group? I have one thought, but Bethany, hi.
I have a thought, and I think honestly, Jackie, I think one of the greatest answers to that is more diversity and advancement. Is that I think that if we were more diverse, we would be more able to say, you can trust what I'm saying. This is genuine and authentic because this is me. And so I think that if we can, if advancement can become more diverse, it'll solve a lot of problems in a lot of these areas.
I agree. However, that is a hard push within a 6-month window when we're being challenged to raise this $1 million in.
It's very much a long-term answer to that, Jackie.
and that's a good example of when we in advancement do feasibility studies all the time. That is like what we do, and they may not be official feasibility studies, but we do feasibility studies all the time. When we're fundraising for a project and we have the timeline is truly somewhat arbitrary. That's a structural thing that's created internally. And I get the position you're in, Jackie, but I look at it as a big structure of like, in our feasibility study, have we engaged enough communities of color? Does our board represent the diversity that's in the community that represents our communities of color? Is our fundraising staff there? Those are the kinds of things where we really need to start looking at exactly what Bethany said. Like, how are we how are we reflective of the diversity that's there? And if we're not, that needs to be part of our study. Because if we're not necessarily well equipped. Sure, it can happen, but it's going to be challenging to not have that savior sort of narrative attached to it. So that's sort of my thought. But my other thought I would just say is it's really, I think narratives are really important, but consent around narratives are even more important. And so there are ways to sort of identify and see if there are students who are willing to kind of share their own narrative around their scholarship. But I want to be, it's also something we have to be really careful around. I know from the donor standpoint, a lot of donors I work with want to see the student stories. And sometimes I want to be so conscientious of not exploiting our students in any way. And so one way we've kind of started to do this a little bit more is have a clear expectation. If you are a recipient of the scholarship, here's sort of the kinds of things like the donor is really going to want a letter of sort of putting those things up front. It doesn't totally solve the problem, but I think it's at least a little bit of like, here's a little bit more expectation that's on the front end. So a student isn't put in a position where they sort of feel like they have to tell a story. That makes any sense.
Well, so from us at the School of Medicine, I think we've done a pretty good job of building the partnership that current students are encouraged to share their stories as a part of an expectation as they are part of the pipeline as future alumni, right? So it's personally their voice, or their authentic voice, speaks far more than my voice ever will. I'm not going to leave medical school with $190,000 in debt, but I can speak and open the door for somebody to advocate for that. So those are the challenges that I see.
Thank you, Jackie. And we're going to talk more about this too, about the scholarship and opportunities. Any other thoughts about the healthcare side?
Dhiraj, I'm not a healthcare professional, but I have a thought. I was just reflecting on what Bethany said earlier, and I was thinking about these connections to white saviorism that are just really inherent in our gatekeeping and connecting the two. And so I think the more we have white folks that are acting as gatekeepers of these funds, of these programs, and I say this as somebody who comes from a social work degree, which is basically just a white saviorism degree in a lot of ways, at least as I experienced it a decade ago. But just thinking about so much of the systemic racism that's inherent in the way we set up these gatekeepers. So not putting this necessarily on individuals, but it feels good to be in charge of who gets the money and who gets into these programs. As a white person deciding those things, you get to hold up the stories of the deserving poor that you've rescued from whatever hardship, and ignore the ones that you don't. And I know it's more complicated and nuanced than that, but I like to kind of critique the gatekeeperiness that I have in my work, and think about how in love with my gatekeeper position sometimes I might be.
Yeah, that's a I don't know if it's a challenging of a bias or a challenging of a level of power and authority. But that's such a good point, Ella, that there's probably even levels of gatekeeping. And where maybe what is, I'll throw this to the advancement professionals of what is your level of gatekeeping and how do you sort of challenge it? And we don't have to talk about it now, but I think that's a really good point, Ella. Okay, we're going to move on to one more area, and I'm looking at Jesse and some of our cultural organizations here at the U. Community, where do we see this in community? And maybe I'll specify community programs, deficit-based thinking community programs.
This is actually really well timed because at the Natural History Museum, you know, we are in the process of completing a community needs-based assessment for some of the specific communities we work with around the valley. And it, it was such a learning process for us, just as we structured like how we reach out to people, who we reach out to, and what questions we ask. Because, you know, like the age-old question, what would make your community better? Right? Like that's such a classic question that we get asked and asked on surveys. And that in itself is just like perfect example of deficit-based thinking, which is, man, we assume your community sucks. So what can we do to make it better? And so we, you know, so we spent a lot of time really kind of rethinking the questions we're asking and how we ask them in not a deficit-based way, and who we're asking them to, and being really thoughtful about, you know, setting up like one-on-one conversations so people feel like they have the confidence to speak their truth. You know, thinking about how to do it in a way so that individuals from the museum who are asking these questions and meeting with people, you know, they're fluent in Spanish and other languages. So, you know, thinking about how to make this a like asset-based, accessible conversation for, you know, the people that we're meeting with and seeking advice and input and guidance from. And really it's about, you know, the question is not how can we make your community better, but it's, you know, what are the really exciting and wonderful things about your community, and how can we add to that? And so that's been like a really helpful learning process for us. And is something I will say, like, we haven't been doing that for years. This has been a real turning point for us just over the last year or two or three, as we've been thinking about kind of outreach to the people that we serve.
Jesse, I'm so excited to hear sort of the progress and the journey of that. And I'm glad that natural history is sort of engaging in that shift there. That's really neat. It'll be exciting to hear what that looks like in 2 years and 5 years and so forth. One of the organizations I think a lot about is the University Neighborhood Partners. And, you know, I think originally and initially, the thought was, oh, we need to get a better pipeline to West Salt Lake City, to the University of Utah. That was sort of the original kind of idea. And what I've really appreciated about University Neighborhood Partners work is that they sort of look at themselves as an organization as almost community incubators. They don't have the capital on knowledge. They don't have the capital on culture. They don't have the capital on really what are the best needs for the community. They don't pretend they have that. Instead, they help create spaces that kind of activate those conversations within the community. And they are one, but not the voice in a community. And they just sort of help bring people together. I've really always liked UNP's model. There, at any given time, there could be projects that are, and these are community-based and community-identified projects that are either a college or like a soccer team, or a collaborative mural. Really, the projects range. One is like classes on technical skills for the refugee community, and it's again, it's all sort of built by the community for the community, and it's UNP just sort of helps connect people and connect resources. And I really like their motto. I probably explained that terribly, but I look at them really as an incubator, and there's an aspect of it that's mutually beneficial and reciprocal and communal. That's really important. I know, Catherine, I'm going to put you kind of on the spot, but I know that our outreach and prevention efforts at the Rape Recovery Center really tries to take that sort of thought, where we're not going in and teaching, we're not just outright going into communities of color and just teaching prevention efforts that we're working closely with the community. Catherine, you want to talk a little about that?
Sorry, it took me a minute to find the unmute button. Yeah, so I think it's really important to identify the leaders in the community who are already doing the work, who have been doing the work, who have built trust and engagement with communities that they are part of. And then approaching those communities and asking, how can we help? How can we support? And I think that there's a huge correlation there to what you described with UPH, that, we're not the experts on someone's well-being or community's well-being. And that there is an inherent there's a problematic piece to that, right? That if you approach the work from I'm an expert and I'm helping you, I'm gonna, save this situation, we're perpetuating dynamics and structures that are harmful. So yeah, I hope that's what you're looking for, Dhiraj.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Catherine. We'll move on unless we have any other examples. Okay, I just like this quote a lot. It's there's so much more to doing good work than making a difference. There's the principle of first, do no harm. This is the idea that those who are being helped ought to be consulted over the matters which concern them. Absolutely. That's a respect principle that we as fundraisers, I mean, that's one of the things where we try our hardest to do well, is that respect aspect of it. And that goes to the programs and connecting people too. So yes, I will share this. I'll share the slide, I'll share the quote, and I'll share the study and a few other toolkits for everybody. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to just briefly glaze over this. We've talked a lot about tokenism, and special shout out to the Office of Equity and Diversity. And at the time, my sister Neelam, who worked as their communication director and now has her own company around diversity, equity, and inclusion, she and the team helped create these two toolkits, and they're just, I think they're really phenomenal. So the one on asset and deficit-based thinking, and then this one on tokenism, I really think just kind of helps us practicalize how to do some of this work. And it's not by all means any like the end all be all. Things change so much, language changes. But I really liked sort of this checklist here of like, don't oversimplify the fake diversity, the cherry picking of images. If you want to have, if you want to look at some good examples of deficit-based thinking, go to like a stock photo website and type in diversity, or type in, just any major keywords. And there's a lot of great examples. The stock photo website just curates it so beautifully, probably unintentionally. This is something we're really good at in higher ed. It's the self-congratulating around diversity. And so anyways, this is just a really good toolkit. I'll send this to everybody. I really love the idea of person first narratives. Of course, number one important thing there is consent on that. And then this is just, someone mentioned this, and I'm now I think it was Bethany, that this is our job in advancement. And I just want to put this out there. There was a study that the Chronicle of Philanthropy did, that 20% of young people between the ages of 18 and 30 made a donation in the past few months to address racial inequity, discrimination, or social injustice, according to the Chronicle of Philanthropy survey conducted at the time of the murder of George Floyd. And that's a really important number. That's one of the highest numbers we've ever seen collective mobility around philanthropy from this demographic. And so it just sort of goes to show that this is not a fad, that our future philanthropists are thinking very much in the way of racial justice in a way that I don't think we've had before. I think it'd be quick to point out that these movements are not new. This is not a new thing. Racial justice is not new. There's a lot of work that has gone into this. There's a lot of murder and inequity that has happened to get to this point. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that This is a long road that was paved by many people and tragedies and structural issues. And so it's just a continuation of this work, but I thought this was a really promising sort of future. So if I were to leave this group with one thing, it's anti-racism work and challenging deficit-based thinking is imperative to excellent higher education advancement work. The one thing, so that might look very different for how we do that. There's a lot of great ideas here today, but just want to sort of leave you with that. And thank you. We have like 3 minutes for questions or comments, and then go from there. Okay, Ella, I'm gonna get to your question, my favorite karaoke song. Janzo Tudor, who has a competing session with me right now, her and I, we like to sing Love's an Open Door from Frozen.
Oh, very, very good choice. Thank you.
It's fun. And then, I've got a whole bunch. Anything Broadway, that's me. 90s pop, that's me as well. Nice. I haven't figured out Bollywood karaoke yet. But that will happen soon, I'm sure.
These are all good choices. I'm just picturing your Aries singing them.
Oh, Ella, we're going to invite you to the next Zoom karaoke party.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, 90s pop's vital. Yep. Bethany, I don't think we've karaoke'd yet. Okay, I've got to invite you.
Yes.
Yes, I'm happy to share the Adobe Spark presentation. Thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate everybody coming to this and spending your afternoon focusing on racism in higher education and philanthropy in particular this session. I believe next month there's another session on sort of the next major steps and the movement forward around racism in higher education. It should be a really wonderful presentation and some more breakout sessions. So if there's things that you want to see in terms of breakout sessions, please contact the Office of Equity and Diversity. I also love feedback. Any kind of feedback, just message me. I'll send my contact information out to this group as well. I really appreciate any kind of feedback. And I hope to do more of these presentations and would love collaborators if they're interested in that. Please, Bethany, I'm signing you up if you're interested.
Great.
Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.